Imagine this. You wake up, it's cold. Not like, oh, I should grab a hoodie cold. I mean the kind of cold where your breath turns into a cloud the second it leaves your mouth, where the ground is frozen solid, and where every single instinct in your body is screaming at you to find warmth. Now, you don't have a heater, you don't have a blanket, you don't even have walls. You have a cave, maybe, some rocks, some sticks, and the fur of an animal you just killed with your bare hands and a sharpened stone. Now here's the real question. Do you put that fur on your body or do you just leave it there? Because here's the thing, most people assume ancient humans just wandered around completely naked, like cave-dwelling nudists who hadn't figured out the concept of embarrassment yet. Popular culture loves this image. The loincloth-wearing, club-carrying, grunt-speaking caveman who barely had two brain cells to rub together. But that image? It's wrong. Like, embarrassingly wrong. And today we're going to dig into the actual truth of when, why, and how ancient humans started wearing clothes, and what that tells us about just how sophisticated these people really were. Because, spoiler alert, the story of ancient clothing is not just about staying warm. It's about survival strategy, social identity, long-distance trade, and a level of cognitive complexity that most people would never associate with someone who lived hundreds of thousands of years ago. So let's get into it. First, let's talk about why this question is so hard to answer in the first place. Clothing doesn't fossilize. Think about that for a second. We have bones, we have tools, we have cave art, we have hearths, we have fossilized food remains, but fabric, plant fibers, animal skins stitched together with sinew, those are organic materials, and organic materials decompose. They rot. They vanish into the soil over thousands of years and leave absolutely nothing behind. This is the fundamental problem with studying ancient clothing. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found ancient shirts doesn't mean ancient humans were running around exposed to the elements like they simply forgot that animal skin existed. We have to use indirect evidence. And that indirect evidence is actually fascinating. So what do we look for? Three main things: tools, needles, and lice. Yes, lice. We'll get to that. Let's start with the tools. When archaeologists dig up ancient sites, they find these small, carefully crafted stone tools called scrapers. These aren't the big dramatic hand axes that look like something out of a movie. These are smaller, precise instruments shaped and sharpened to do a very specific job, scraping fat and tissue off the inside of animal hides. This is called hide processing, and it's a critical step in turning a raw animal skin into something you can actually wear. Now here's what's interesting. We find these hide scraping tools going back a very long time. We're talking hundreds of thousands of years. Sites across Africa and Eurasia are littered with evidence that ancient humans were processing animal hides on a consistent, intentional basis. And this wasn't just for food storage or camp decoration. The scale and the precision of these tools suggest that people knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing it regularly. But there's a difference between processing a hide and actually wearing it as clothing. You could process a hide to use as a sleeping mat, a water carrier, a tent covering, or a carrying sack. So the tools alone don't tell us everything. They tell us that ancient humans were working with animal skins, but not necessarily that they were wearing them as garments in any structured way. For that, we need to look at something much more specific. Enter the bone needle. The bone needle is arguably one of the most underrated technological achievements in all of human history. Think about what a needle actually does. It allows you to take separate pieces of material, hide, plant fiber, whatever, and connect them together in a way that conforms to the shape of a body. Without a needle, you can wrap yourself in a hide. With a needle, you can make a fitted garment. Those are two completely different things. The oldest definitively confirmed bone needles we've found come from around 50,000 years ago in Siberia. That's 50,000 years ago. But there are claims based on perforated bones that may have been used for similar purposes, that push that date back even further, possibly to 100,000 years ago or beyond, depending on which archaeologist you ask. The scientific community is still debating some of those older finds, but the fact that they're even in the conversation is telling. What's remarkable about these ancient needles is the craftsmanship involved. Creating a bone needle requires you to first select the right type of bone, typically a small, dense bone from a bird or small mammal. Then you have to carefully split it, grind it down to the right shape and thickness, and then, this is the part that blows people's minds, drill a tiny hole through one end to thread the sinew through. All of this using only stone tools. That is not the work of a creature that's just stumbling through existence. That's intentional, multi-step, planned problem solving of a very high order. Someone looked at a bone, looked at a hide, understood that one could be used to connect pieces of the other, figured out the entire mechanical sequence, and executed it with precision. That is sophisticated cognition. Full stop. Now let's talk about the lice. This is genuinely one of my favorite pieces of evidence in all of ancient human research because it is so unexpected and so elegant. Humans have two main types of lice, head lice and body lice. Head lice live in your hair. Body lice, on the other hand, live in clothing. They need fabric or some kind of textile to lay their eggs. They can't reproduce properly on bare skin alone. They need that warm, slightly insulated environment that clothing provides. Here's the key insight. Head lice and body lice are descended from a common ancestor. At some point, a population of head lice adapted to life in clothing and became body lice. That evolutionary divergence, that moment when lice split into two separate populations, can be estimated using genetic analysis. And when scientists did exactly that, they found something remarkable. Body lice diverged from head lice somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. That's a huge range, yes, and the exact date is debated. But even the more conservative estimate of 83,000 years ago means that ancient humans were wearing some form of clothing, regularly enough for a parasitic population to evolve specifically to live in it, at least 83,000 years before you were born. Let that sink in. A parasite evolved to live in human clothing before modern civilization, before agriculture, before writing, before any of the things we typically associate with advanced human behavior. Body lice exist because ancient humans were so consistently clothed that lice had to adapt to their wardrobes. Nature itself is out here confirming that ancient humans wore clothes. But let's go even deeper because the question of why ancient humans wore clothes is just as fascinating as the question of when. The obvious answer is thermoregulation, staying warm. And yes, that's a huge part of it. Humans are actually quite poorly adapted for cold climates compared to other large mammals. We don't have thick fur. We don't have a significant layer of subcutaneous fat in the way that, say, a walrus does. We have relatively large surface areas compared to our mass, which means we lose heat quickly. And yet, ancient humans spread into some of the coldest environments on Earth: Siberia, the Arctic, Central Asia during glacial periods, tens of thousands of years ago. How? Clothing. Specifically, tailored clothing. Fitted layered garments that trapped body heat. This wasn't optional, it was survival critical. Without adequate clothing, you simply cannot survive in those environments. The human body starts shutting down at core temperatures below 35 degrees Celsius. You don't get to debate whether you feel like wearing a fur today. You either figure it out or you die. But here's where it gets really interesting. Clothing wasn't just functional in the sense of keeping you warm, it also served social functions that we can actually trace through the archaeological record. Let's talk about pigments and ornaments for a second, because this connects directly to the question of how clothing functioned socially. We know from multiple ancient sites across Africa and the Middle East that ancient humans were using red ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide pigment going back at least 160,000 to 200,000 years. And one of the strong hypotheses for how this pigment was used is that it was applied to clothing, specifically to animal hides, as a form of decoration or symbolic marking. In many traditional societies that anthropologists have studied, body paint and clothing decoration aren't just aesthetic. They carry information. They tell you about someone's social group, their status, their ritual role, their family lineage. These aren't frivolous additions to clothing. They're a communication system. They're saying something. And if ancient humans 200,000 years ago were using pigments to decorate themselves or their clothing, that implies a level of symbolic thinking, of group identity, of social structure that goes far beyond just, I need to not freeze to death. We also find ancient beads, perforated shells and teeth from incredibly early dates. Some of the oldest are from sites in Morocco and Israel, dating back around 130,000 to 150,000 years. Now, beads can be worn directly on the body, but they can also be sewn onto clothing. And their existence tells us the same thing the ochre does. These people were thinking about appearance in a deliberate, communicative way. They weren't just surviving, they were presenting themselves. Let's zoom in on a specific and extraordinary archaeological find that brings all of this together. In the Denisova cave in Siberia, yes, the same cave where we found evidence of the Denisovans, a separate branch of ancient human relatives, archaeologists have recovered not just the famous pinky bone and teeth of the Denisovans themselves, but also artifacts that suggest remarkably sophisticated behavior, including what appears to be worked ivory and perforated animal teeth that were likely used as ornaments attached to clothing or worn on the body. The layers of this cave are incredibly deep and span hundreds of thousands of years, and the complexity of what's found in those layers keeps increasing as we dig. The site is a window into a world where multiple ancient human groups, Denisovans, Neanderthals, and eventually our own species, Homo sapiens, either lived at different times or, in some extraordinary cases, interacted and interbred. All of them at various points seem to have been making and using clothing-related items. This isn't a uniquely modern human thing. The capacity for clothed, decorated, socially communicating existence seems to run much deeper in the human family tree than most people realize. Now, let's talk about Neanderthals specifically, because they deserve their own moment here. Neanderthals get a rough reputation. In popular culture, Neanderthal is basically an insult. It implies someone who is brutish, slow-witted, unsophisticated. But the actual archaeological evidence tells a wildly different story, and clothing is a major part of it. Neanderthals lived in Europe and Western Asia for roughly 400,000 years, and for much of that time they were living through ice ages. Not "it's a bit chilly" ice ages. Real, brutal, landscape-defining ice ages where glaciers covered large parts of the continent and temperatures regularly dropped to levels that would kill an unclothed human in hours. And yet they survived. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals thrived in these conditions. How? Researchers at the University of Copenhagen did a fascinating study where they analyzed the ratio of different types of animal bones at Neanderthal sites and compared them to what we see at anatomically modern human sites in similar climates. What they found was striking. At anatomically modern human sites in cold climates, there was a much higher proportion of small, fur-bearing animals. Foxes, rabbits, hares. These animals don't provide a lot of meat, but they provide excellent fur. And they were being hunted in numbers that make no sense if you're only interested in calories. Neanderthal sites showed fewer of these small fur-bearing animals, which led some researchers to suggest that Neanderthals may have relied more heavily on the hides of large mammals, cave bears, woolly rhinoceros, mammoth for their clothing. And there's evidence they were processing these hides extensively. We find the same hide scraping tools at Neanderthal sites. We know they were doing the work. But here's the really remarkable part. A different team of researchers looking at Neanderthal skeletal remains found evidence of a pattern of injury and muscle stress that is consistent with large-scale hide working, meaning the physical act of scraping and processing hides left marks on Neanderthal bodies. Their skeletons tell us what their hands were doing, and what their hands were doing for tens of thousands of years was making clothing. There's another angle to this that I find genuinely mind-blowing, and it has to do with the cognitive and planning abilities that clothing requires. We tend to think of ancient humans as reactive creatures. An animal dies, they eat it. It gets cold, they maybe wrap themselves in something. But real, functional clothing, especially clothing suited to extreme cold, requires something much more than a reactive response to immediate circumstances. Think about what making cold weather clothing actually involves. First, you need to hunt the right animals at the right times when their coats are at their thickest. Then you need to kill them and process the hides quickly before they spoil. You need to scrape the fat off the inside and tan the hide using a process that requires either brains, urine, or specific bark. Yes, you read that right. Ancient tanning methods are absolutely wild to keep it from rotting and becoming rigid. Then you need to cut the hide into pieces that will conform to a human body shape, sew them together using sinew and a bone needle, and potentially layer multiple pieces for maximum insulation. And you don't do this in the moment. You do this in the summer or fall in preparation for a winter that you know is coming. You are planning ahead. You are modeling a future scenario. It will be cold, I will need this. And taking action in the present to prepare for it. That is prospective cognition. That is future-directed behavior. That is not the behavior of a creature that only reacts to its immediate environment. That is the behavior of a mind that can represent the future as something real and worthy of preparation. And ancient humans, going back tens and potentially hundreds of thousands of years, were doing exactly this. Let's take a detour into plant-based textiles for a moment, because animal hides are only part of the story. In the country of Georgia, in a cave called Zutzuana, archaeologists found something truly remarkable: flax fibers. And not just raw flax fibers, some of them had been twisted and cut, and a significant portion of them had been dyed with natural pigments in colors including black, gray, turquoise, and pink. These fibers date to approximately 34,000 years ago. That's 34,000 years ago that someone was growing or gathering flax, processing it into usable fiber, dyeing it with color, colors and apparently using it for some kind of textile purpose. This is before agriculture. This is before settled villages. This is a fully mobile ancient human society doing what amounts to proto-textile manufacturing. The range of colors is particularly striking. You need turquoise and pink because of what? Aesthetic preference. Because you wanted your clothing to look a certain way. Because you had an idea in your head of how you wanted to present yourself to other members of your group, and you took the time and effort to make that happen. There is no survival advantage to pink. Pink does not keep you warmer. Pink is not more resistant to wear. Pink is a choice. And choices made purely on aesthetic grounds are a hallmark of a mind that exists beyond pure survival calculations. Now here's a question I want to pose because I think it reframes everything. Why does it matter whether ancient humans wore clothes? On one level, sure, it's just a historical curiosity. But on a deeper level, the answer to this question is actually a proxy for something much more significant. What were ancient humans really like? What was their inner world? What was the nature of their minds? Because if ancient humans wore only the most rudimentary scraps of hide draped loosely over their bodies, that tells one story. A story of a creature barely clinging to existence, operating on pure instinct, no different in kind from any other large mammal. But if ancient humans were crafting fitted, layered garments from multiple materials, decorating them with pigments and beads, planning their production months in advance, and using clothing as a medium for social signaling and group identity, Tarat, that tells a completely different story. A story of a creature with rich inner lives, complex social structures, aesthetic sensibilities, and cognitive abilities that look much more familiar than we might expect. And based on everything we've discussed, the bone needles, the hide-scraping tools, the lice genetics, the flax fibers, the pigments, the ornaments, the evidence overwhelmingly supports the second story. Ancient humans were not naked brutes. They were people. Let me bring this back to something tangible. There's an ancient site in Morocco called Contrabandier's Cave. And in 2021, a team of researchers published a study in the journal Science detailing their analysis of animal bones found at the site. These bones dated to around 120,000 years ago, and what made them remarkable was the pattern of cut marks on them. The researchers found bones from carnivores, specifically foxes, jackals, and wildcats that had been defleshed and had their tendons removed in a very specific pattern. This pattern was different from how these animals were processed for food. The cut marks were concentrated on the areas where the pelt meets the bone, in exactly the locations where you'd expect them if someone was carefully removing a fur pelt while preserving it intact. In other words, someone 120,000 years ago was selectively hunting carnivores specifically for their fur pelts and processing those pelts with careful, practiced technique, not for food, for wearing. 120,000 years ago. That's not some fringe site with questionable dating. That's a well-documented site with a strong team behind the analysis and a peer-reviewed publication in one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. Clothing production, at a sophisticated level, 120,000 years ago. I want to spend a moment talking about the geography of this, because it adds another fascinating layer. The earliest evidence of clothing and textile production that we've discussed comes primarily from Africa, the Middle East, and Eurasia. And that distribution is not random. It maps almost perfectly onto the expansion routes of ancient human populations as they moved out of Africa and into progressively harsher climates. The further north and east ancient humans moved, the colder the climate became, and the more critical sophisticated clothing became for survival. We see a clear ramp-up in clothing-related evidence, more needles, more hide-scraping tools, more elaborate ornaments sewn onto garments, as populations pushed into Siberia, into the Arctic, into the cold steppes of Central Asia. This suggests that clothing technology was not just invented once and spread. It was likely invented multiple times, in multiple places, by different groups of ancient humans responding to similar environmental pressures. And it was almost certainly improved and innovated upon continuously, generation after generation, as people developed better techniques, better tools, and better understanding of materials. The fact that clothing technology developed independently in multiple locations is itself evidence of how cognitively capable these ancient populations were. Innovation doesn't happen by accident. It requires a mind that can identify a problem, conceive of a solution, test that solution, and refine it over time. Ancient humans were doing all of that, and they were doing it with their lives literally on the line.